Hey y'all, it's entry number 43 of this off-season series where we discuss a different player's fantasy value each day as a group. We are another day closer to the start of the 2022 NFL season. Each day we'll drop a name, go through some positives and some concerns of their fantasy profile, and then I'll give my personal opinion at the end. Today's discussion will be on Courtland Sutton, wide receiver, Denver Broncos. We'll start with the positives with Sutton's fantasy profile. Quarterback upgrade. The Denver Broncos made a trade for Russell Wilson this offseason, who will be by far the best quarterback that Sutton has played with in his career. Over the course of his career, Wilson has averaged 19.5 completions on 30 passing attempts for 234.6 passing yards and 1.85 passing touchdowns per game. Having a quarterback that can throw over 25 passing touchdowns a year bodes well for Sutton and the rest of the Broncos pass catchers. The next thing I really like about Courtland Sutton's fantasy profile is his air yards and potential room for growth. In 2021, Sutton had 1,534 air yards, the 8th best among wide receivers, and 892 unrealized air yards according to Player Profiler. According to fantasy data, Courtland Sutton had a 35.4% air yard share in 2021, which ranked as the 13th most among wide receivers. These air yards totals suggest that if Sutton can get on the same page with his quarterback in 2022 and capitalize on his high percentage of unrealized air yards, he could have a top 20 fantasy wide receiver type of season. The last thing I really like about Sutton's fantasy profile is that he has already flashed a strong fantasy ceiling. During the 2019 NFL season, Sutton had a great year where he had 72 receptions on 124 targets for 1,112 receiving yards and 6 receiving touchdowns. In fantasy leagues, he finished as the WR17 in standard with 150.4 total fantasy points and 9.4 fantasy points per game, the WR19 in half PPR formats with 186.4 total fantasy points and 11.7 fantasy points per game, and the WR19 in full PPR formats with 222.4 total fantasy points and 13.9 fantasy points per game according to Fantasy Pros. Moving on to some of the concerns with Courtland Sutton's fantasy profile. Competition for targets. The Denver Broncos have quite a few receivers with potential on their roster besides Courtland Sutton, in Jerry Jeudy, Tim Patrick, and KJ Hamler. By having a bunch of other capable wide receivers, the Broncos don't necessarily have to force feed Sutton in 2022, and his target share could be more mediocre relative to other players going around his average draft position. The next concern I have with Sutton's fantasy profile is that he's a possible one-season wonder. Courtland Sutton has had just one season in his NFL career thus far where he's had over 800 receiving yards in 2019. It's easier to excuse him being subpar in the 2018 season where he was a rookie and the 2020 season where he was injured and only played one game, but he did play all 17 games last year and ended up with just 58 receptions on 98 targets for 776 receiving yards and 2 receiving touchdowns according to Pro Football Reference. There is an outside possibility that he's just a one-year wonder and we are just chasing his 2019 numbers in vain. The last major concern I have with Courtland Sutton's fantasy profile is that he has little yards after the catch ability. In his career, Courtland Sutton has put up yards after the catch season totals of 163 in 2018, 352 in 2019, 7 in 2020, and 135 in 2021 according to Pro Football Reference. His 135 yards after the catch ranked just 176th in the NFL during the 2021 season according to Pro Football Reference, and this shows that he may be a little more reliant on his quarterback's abilities to be successful compared to some other players that have more yards after the catch ability and can make stuff happen by themselves. Some additional thoughts on Courtland Sutton's fantasy profile. During the 2021 season, in total season fantasy points, Courtland Sutton finished as the WR47 in standard with 92.2 total fantasy points and 5.4 fantasy points per game, the WR46 in half PPR formats with 121.2 total fantasy points and 7.1 fantasy points per game, and the WR44 in full PPR formats, with 150.2 total fantasy points and 8.8 fantasy points per game, according to Fantasy Pros. In half PPR formats, during the 2021 season, Courtland Sutton had 8 out of 17 games with 0 to 4.9 fantasy points, 6 out of 17 games with 5 to 10 fantasy points, 0 out of 17 games with 10 to 15 fantasy points, 1 out of 17 games with 15 to 20 fantasy points, and 2 out of 17 games with 20 to 25 fantasy points according to fantasy data. The Denver Broncos made a coaching change this offseason and will have a change in play callers because of it, going from former offensive coordinator Pat Shurmur calling the plays to new head coach Nathaniel Hackett calling the plays. Hackett has gotten slightly above average production out of his wide receivers over the course of his career as an offensive coordinator, but we'll have to see what approach he takes as a head coach. Personal opinion. As of early July 2022, Courtland Sutton is going off the board as WR27, about pick 71 overall, on ESPN, and WR19, about pick 58 overall, on Yahoo. While I understand the intrigue with Russell Wilson now in the mix, his Yahoo ADP seems really high for a guy who played all 17 games last year and didn't even crack the top 40 wide receivers in any format. There is a chance that he has a career arc like Allen Robinson, as a big wide receiver who has little yards after the catch ability, but still had a strong season early in his career with bad quarterbacks, who tears his ACL, has a couple of subpar seasons, and then returns to form, and experiences the best season of his career this year. But it seems that people may be going slightly overboard on his potential right now, at least on Yahoo, where he's going ahead of guys like Mike Williams. For each of these entries, we will highlight a charitable cause or organization that the player is passionate about. According to his website, Courtland Sutton adopted 4 families from the Boys and Girls Club of Denver and surprised them with dinner and Christmas gifts. Giving back to this organization is especially meaningful to Sutton. His mother worked for the Boys and Girls Club of America during his childhood, and he saw firsthand the positive impact it has on local communities. Here's a link to that organization below. And that's it for today's entry. If you enjoyed this entry, be sure to like and subscribe.